The prefect duty roster hung on the Gryffindor notice board for 3 days before anyone attempted to correct the scheduling conflict in the fourth-floor corridor assignments. 2 prefects, Ron Weasley and Padma Patil, had been allocated the same Tuesday evening shift, while the adjacent Thursday slot remained unassigned. Neville Longbottom noticed the error on his second pass through the common room that week, when he paused near the board to check the revised herbology practicum schedule. He did not mention it. Prefect administrative errors typically resolve themselves through staff intervention or student complaint. By Friday, someone had crossed out Ron's name in pencil and written in Carmichael E instead. The system had corrected itself without requiring input from 6th-year non-prefects who monitored notice boards too carefully. Neville's attention to such postings had increased since September term began. The 6th-year timetable allowed for several unstructured periods, each week, gaps intended for private study or NEWT preparation. He used these intervals to occupy common areas, the library's ground floor study section, the corridor outside the Transfiguration classroom, the courtyard between the greenhouses, and the main castle entrance. These were transitional spaces where younger students moved between lessons without staff supervision. On the second Monday of term, Neville observed a 4th-year Slytherin named Warrington stop a Hufflepuff first year near the library entrance. The exchange lasted approximately 2 minutes. Warrington stood directly in the younger student's path. The first year held a stack of 3 books, spine labels visible, basic hexes for the busy and vexed, the standard book of spells, grade 1, and 1,000 magical herbs and fungi. Warrington said something too quiet for Neville to hear from his position near the study carrels. The first year's face flushed. He nodded twice, stepped sideways, and continued into the library at a faster pace than necessary. Warrington did not follow. He returned to the main corridor, rejoining 2 other Slytherin students who had waited several meters away. All 3 left toward the dungeons. Neville waited 5 minutes, then entered the library himself. The first year had taken a seat at the farthest table from the entrance, in the alcove near Madame Pince's desk, where older students rarely sat due to proximity to staff oversight. The books remained stacked on the table, unopened. The students' hands were flat against the wooden surface. Neville selected a herbology reference from the nearest shelf, Flesh-Eating Trees of the World, which he had already read, and sat 3 tables away. The first year did not move for the remainder of the period. When the bell chimed for the next lesson rotation, he gathered his books and left without having opened any of them. The library operated on a standard rotation schedule. Madame Pince maintained staffing from 800 to 2,100 daily, with reduced supervision during meal periods when student traffic decreased. Prefects were not assigned library duty. Oversight remained with the librarian and her cataloguing assistants, 7th-year students who received academic credit for administrative work. This left certain predictable gaps. Between 1800 and 1830, when most students attended dinner in the Great Hall, the library's ground floor remained technically open but functionally unmonitored. Madame Pince took her evening meal during this window, and the cataloguing assistants observed the same schedule. Neville began spending this half-hour period in the library on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He brought course materials and worked through herbology readings or potions problem sets at one of the central tables. His presence was unremarkable, Sixth years frequently used free periods for independent study. On the third Thursday of September, the Hufflepuff first year entered the library at 18:15. He carried the same 3 books from the previous encounter. This time, Warrington and another Slytherin, a fifth-year Neville, did not recognize, entered 2 minutes later. They took seats at the table, directly beside the first year's position. Neville closed his potions textbook and stood. He crossed to the first year's table and sat down across from him without requesting permission. "You're reading ahead in charms," Neville said, keeping his voice level. "Professor Flitwick assigns that summoning chapter for next week." The first year looked up. His name badge, partially visible on his robes, read Summers, C. "Yes," Summers said. "The practice room on the second floor has better lighting," Neville continued. "And there's a supply of practice objects stored in the cupboard. Feathers, wooden blocks, nothing that causes damage if the spell misfires. You can sign out a key from Flitwick's office during his consultation hours." This was accurate. The Charms practice room operated on an open access basis for students preparing for practical examinations. Professor Flitwick maintained irregular office hours, but reliably remained available on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. Summers glanced towards the adjacent table, where Warrington had opened a potions textbook but was not reading it. "I was going to practice here," Summers said quietly. "The practice room is better," Neville said. "More space. The tables here aren't positioned well for wand movement. Professor Flitwick recommends the practice room for all summoning work." This was not something Professor Flitwick had said, but it aligned with standard safety protocols for active spell work. Summers hesitated, then gathered his books. He stood and left the library without further comment. Warrington watched him leave, but did not follow. Neville returned to his own table. He opened his potions textbook and continued reading. Warrington and his companion remained for another 10 minutes, then departed as well. The library returned to its baseline emptiness for the remainder of the half-hour gap. Prefect patrol assignments for corridor monitoring operated on a 2-week rotating schedule. Each house contributed 2 prefects per night, distributed across 4 time blocks: 1900 to 2000, 2000 to 2100, 2100 to 2200, and 2200 to 2300. The system prioritized coverage for high-traffic areas, corridors connecting common rooms to the Great Hall, classroom wings, and the library. Lower priority zones, including sections of the 4th and 6th floors and certain staircases, received reduced patrol frequency. Neville did not have access to the master schedule. It was posted only in prefect common areas and staff offices. However, he could track general patterns by noting which prefects appeared in which locations during evening hours. Ron and Hermione held predictable assignments on Monday and Wednesday evenings. Padma Patil appeared on Tuesday nights. Ernie Macmillan covered Thursday. On Friday evenings, patrol coverage appeared thinner. Neville confirmed this by walking the 4th floor corridor near the library at 20:30. He encountered no prefects during a 15-minute observation period. On the following Friday, he repeated the exercise and observed the same gap. The 4th floor corridor, which connected the library to the Gryffindor dormitory staircases, was not being monitored during the 2000 to 2100 block on Fridays. He did not report this. Patrol schedules were administrative matters managed by the head boy, head girl, and supervising staff. Gaps in coverage were either intentional resource allocations or errors that would surface through other reporting mechanisms. Instead, Neville adjusted his own movements. On Friday evenings, after dinner, he began taking longer routes back to Gryffindor Tower. He walked the fourth-floor corridor at a steady pace, pausing occasionally to examine notice boards or look out of windows overlooking the grounds. This added approximately 10 minutes to his return journey, but did not violate curfew or restrict his access to study time. The third Friday of September, Neville encountered Summers in the fourth-floor corridor at 20:45. The first year was alone, walking quickly toward the main staircase. His book bag hung unevenly over one shoulder. As Neville approached from the opposite direction, he noted that the bag strap had been partially severed, not torn, but cut cleanly, as though with a severing charm applied at low intensity to avoid complete separation. Summers did not acknowledge Neville as they passed. Neville continued walking until he reached the corridor intersection near the library entrance. Warrington stood there with the same unidentified fifth year from the previous library encounter. Both were facing the direction Summers had come from, apparently concluding a conversation. Neville slowed, but did not stop. He passed the intersection and continued toward the library. Behind him, he heard footsteps retreating toward the staircases. 2 sets, moving at normal pace. No voices. He reached the library entrance and paused. Madame Pince would have completed her evening rounds by this hour, and the library would be staffed by a seventh-year cataloguing assistant until closing at 2100. Neville entered. The ground floor held 6 students, all working quietly at separated tables. None were first years. None appeared distressed. Neville returned to the corridor and walked back toward Gryffindor Tower. The intersection was empty. He continued through the standard route, arriving at the fat lady's portrait at 2055. The common room held the usual Friday evening population. Students finishing assignments, playing Exploding Snap, or preparing for weekend Hogsmeade visits. Ron sat near the fireplace with Harry and Hermione, discussing something related to Quidditch formations. Neville crossed to the 6-year dormitory staircase without stopping to join them. On Monday, during the mid-morning break, between herbology and defense against the dark arts, Neville observed Summers in the entrance courtyard. The first year carried his book bag on both shoulders now, the strap repaired, either by magical mending or replacement. He was walking with 2 other Hufflepuff first years toward the greenhouses. Neville did not approach. The matter appeared resolved through whatever internal processes Hufflepuff students used to manage minor equipment damage. House maintenance issues rarely escalated beyond dormitory-level problem-solving unless they involved safety hazards or repeated vandalism. That afternoon, Professor Snape assigned a partnered potions practical, Draft of Peace, a NEWT, level preparation requiring sustained attention and precise ingredient timing. Neville worked with Ernie Macmillan, who maintained a methodical approach that compensated for Neville's tendency toward measurement errors. They completed the potion 7 minutes before the end of the period and achieved a passing color consistency, though the texture remained slightly grainy. "You've improved since last year," Ernie observed, bottling a sample vial for Snape's evaluation. "Your stirring rhythm is more regular." Neville nodded. He had practiced the standard clockwise-counterclockwise pattern during independent study periods, using water and a wooden rod in an empty classroom. Muscle memory for stirring technique could be developed separately from potion making, reducing variables during actual examinations. After class, as students filed toward the Great Hall for dinner, Neville walked his usual route through the fourth-floor corridor. The library remained open, moderately populated with students completing evening assignments. He did not enter. Instead, he continued to Gryffindor Tower, arriving in time for the general dinner migration. The prefect duty roster had been updated again. A new annotation appeared at the bottom. Friday, 2000 to 2100 corridor assignments under review. Temporary cancellations in effect until further notice. No explanation accompanied the note. No replacement schedule had been posted. Neville read the annotation twice, then proceeded to dinner with the rest of the house. The house point hourglasses stood in the entrance hall, positioned between the main doors and the staircase to the first floor. 4 glass columns, each filled with colored gems corresponding to house colors: rubies for Gryffindor, emeralds for Slytherin, sapphires for Ravenclaw, yellow diamonds for Hufflepuff. The gems rose and fell through a spell-operated mechanism connected to staff record-keeping. When a professor awarded or deducted points, the change registered in the staff ledger and the hourglasses adjusted accordingly within minutes. Students could not directly modify the hourglasses. The system operated through a closed administrative process managed by the headmaster's office. Teaching staff submitted point changes through verbal declaration in classrooms or written notation in department ledgers. These submissions fed into a master record that Dumbledore or his administrative staff reviewed weekly. Discrepancies, duplicate entries, unsigned deductions, or mathematical errors were corrected during this review cycle. Neville passed the hourglasses 4 to 6 times daily, depending on his lesson schedule. Most students paid minimal attention to the displays outside of notable shifts. 50 points awarded for exceptional work, 20 points deducted for rule violations visible enough to warrant public acknowledgement. The day-to-day fluctuations of 5 or 10 points did not attract sustained observation. In the second week of October, Neville noted that Gryffindor had dropped 17 points between breakfast and lunch on Tuesday. This registered as unusual because no major incidents had occurred that morning. He had attended Transfiguration and Herbology, both lessons proceeding routinely, with no disciplinary issues or point awards that he had witnessed. 17 points suggested either a significant single deduction or multiple smaller infractions across different classes. He mentioned this to Seamus Finnegan during lunch. "Probably Snape," Seamus said, without looking up from his plate. "He'll dock points for breathing wrong if you're in Gryffindor." This was plausible. Professor Snape maintained documented patterns of disproportionate point deductions for Gryffindor students, particularly in potions classes. However, Neville had attended potions on Monday, not Tuesday morning. Unless Snape was processing retroactive deductions, which violated standard administrative protocols, the 17 points originated elsewhere. Neville finished his meal and returned to the entrance hall. The Gryffindor hourglass now showed an additional 5-point decrease. 22 points total Since breakfast, he checked the time, 13:15. Afternoon classes had not yet begun. He proceeded to his next lesson, Defense Against the Dark Arts, with Professor Snape, who had assumed the position at the start of term. The class passed without incident. Snape awarded no points and deducted none, though he made several disparaging remarks about Harry's written essay on identifying cursed objects. At 1500, Neville returned to the entrance hall. The Gryffindor hourglass had fallen another 8 points, 30 points in one day, with no observable cause. The following morning, Neville arrived at breakfast 15 minutes early and positioned himself at the Gryffindor table with a clear sight line to the entrance hall. He brought a herbology textbook for visible justification, but did not open it. Instead, he monitored the hourglasses while consuming toast and pumpkin juice. At 7:45, the Gryffindor hourglass dropped 5 points. Neville noted the time on a spare piece of parchment he kept folded in his robe pocket. At 08:02, another 5 points disappeared. At 08:26, 3 points. At 08:44, 7 points. 20 points before morning classes began. He attended charms at 900. Professor Flitwick awarded Hannah Abbott 10 points for successfully performing a Muffliato charm and deducted 3 points from a Ravenclaw student who arrived late without explanation. No Gryffindor students lost points during the lesson. At 10:15, during the break between charms and ancient runes, Neville checked the entrance hall. Gryffindor had lost an additional 12 points. He expanded his parchment notes. Wednesday, 07:45, -5. Wednesday, 08:02, -5. Wednesday, 08:26, -3. Wednesday, 08:44, -7. Wednesday, 10:15, -12. Total, -32 points. He had no access to the staff ledger. Student inquiries about point deductions required formal submission to the head of house, who would then consult the master record and provide explanation if warranted. However, submitting such an inquiry required identifying a specific incident or time frame for investigation. 32 points deducted without visible cause across multiple hours was not sufficiently specific to prompt administrative review. Neville needed more data. Over the next week, he documented point changes at consistent intervals: breakfast, mid-morning break, lunch, mid-afternoon break, dinner, and evening before curfew. He recorded dates, times, and point values. The pattern clarified. Gryffindor lost between 20 and 40 points daily. Deductions occurred in small increments, 3 to 10 points per entry, distributed throughout the day. They did not correlate with visible disciplinary events, lesson schedules, or common rule violations like corridor infractions or curfew breaches. Other houses showed different patterns. Slytherin gained an average of 15 points daily, primarily through classroom performance awards. Ravenclaw maintained steady gains of 10 to 12 points. Hufflepuff fluctuated minimally, losing and gaining points at roughly equivalent rates. Only Gryffindor showed consistent, unexplained losses. By the third week of October, Neville had accumulated 2 parchment sheets of time-stamped data. He cross-referenced this information with his own schedule and those of other 6th-year Gryffindors he could reliably track. Harry, Ron, and Hermione attended similar lesson sequences. Dean and Seamus had variant schedules due to different elective choices. Parvati and Lavender shared yet another configuration. The deductions did not align with any individual student's movements. They appeared random in timing, but systematic in frequency. Neville considered reporting this to Professor McGonagall. As head of Gryffindor House, she maintained oversight of house point administration affecting her students. However, presenting the data required admitting he had been monitoring the hourglasses with unusual attention for 3 weeks. This would prompt questions about his motivations and potentially classify his behavior as excessive concern over house competition, a matter typically managed through Quidditch performance and end-of-year totals rather than daily accounting. He decided to continue documentation without filing a formal report. On Thursday afternoon, Neville observed a piece of information that provided context. He was shelving a herbology reference in the library when he overheard 2 Ravenclaw fifth years discussing house points near the charm section. McGonagall challenged 3 entries last week, one said. All of them were unsigned deductions. Dumbledore removed them from the ledger. Which house? Gryffindor. Something about former educational decree enforcement personnel still submitting point changes without authorization. The conversation continued, but moved toward a different topic. Something about NEWT revision schedules. Neville remained near the shelving cart, processing what he had heard. Educational decree enforcement personnel referred to Dolores Umbridge's inquisitorial squad from the previous year. That system had been formally dissolved when Umbridge was removed from Hogwarts in June. However, if former members retained access to point submission mechanisms, either through administrative oversight or deliberate exploitation of procedural gaps, they could continue filing deductions without proper authorization. Unsigned entries would eventually be identified during weekly reviews, but the correction process required McGonagall to individually challenge each deduction and justify its removal. If deductions were being submitted faster than they could be reviewed and corrected, Gryffindor's point total would show systematic decline despite administrative intervention. Neville returned to the Gryffindor common room and retrieved his parchment notes. He reviewed the timestamps again, searching for additional patterns. The deductions did not occur during lessons or mealtimes. They concentrated during transitional periods, early morning before breakfast, mid-morning breaks, afternoon intervals between classes, and early evening before dinner. These were periods when students moved between locations without direct staff supervision. They were also times when unauthorized individuals could access administrative systems if those systems had not been properly secured after Umbridge's removal. Neville folded the parchment sheets and stored them in his trunk, beneath his folded robes. He did not have sufficient information to identify who was submitting false deductions or how they were accessing the system. He did not have authority to investigate administrative security. He could document the pattern, but documentation alone would not resolve the underlying procedural failure. He could, however, create a parallel record. The library maintained several communal study areas where students could post notices, share resource recommendations, or coordinate group study sessions. These boards operated on an informal basis. Students added and removed materials provided the content remained appropriate and non-disruptive. Neville had observed prefects using these boards to communicate shift changes and study group schedules. On Friday morning, he drafted a simple notice: Gryffindor House, point tracking, unofficial daily point changes, recorded from entrance hall hourglasses, data available for student review upon request. C.N. Longbottom, 6th year. He posted this on the Gryffindor Common Room notice board, adjacent to the prefect duty roster and the Quidditch practice schedule. The notice was small, positioned in a lower corner, where it would not dominate visual attention, but remained accessible to anyone specifically looking for information about house points. 3 students approached him over the weekend. 2 were 5th years preparing for OWLS, who wanted to verify whether their successful transfiguration practicals had registered as point gains. 1 was a 7th-year prefect named Cormac McLagan, who asked whether Neville was undermining house unity by suggesting the point system was compromised. Neville provided the 5th years with his documented timestamps, showing their point awards had registered correctly. He told McLagan that he was tracking data, not suggesting anything, and that McLagan could review the information himself if he wished to verify its accuracy. McLagan declined and walked away. On Monday, Hermione approached Neville in the common room after dinner. "Ron mentioned you've been tracking house points," she said. She did not sit, standing instead near the edge of the 6th-year study area, where Neville was reviewing potions notes. "Yes," Neville said. "For how long?" 3 weeks. Hermione paused. "May I see your records?" Neville retrieved the parchment sheets from his bag and handed them to her. She scanned the columns of timestamps and point values, her expression shifting from neutral inquiry to focused analysis. "These deductions don't correspond to any disciplinary records I'm aware of," she said after 2 minutes. "And I've been monitoring McGonagall's office hours for the prefect coordination meetings. She hasn't mentioned any major rule violations." "No," Neville agreed. "Have you reported this?" "No." Hermione looked at him directly. "Why not?" "Because McGonagall already knows," Neville said. "Someone in the library mentioned she's been challenging unsigned entries. The problem isn't that nobody's noticed. It's that the corrections aren't happening fast enough to prevent the losses from accumulating." Hermione handed the parchment back. "You're creating an independent verification record." "Yes." "That's actually quite smart," Hermione said. "If McGonagall needs supporting documentation to justify a comprehensive audit of the point system, your data could establish a pattern that's harder to dismiss than individual complaints." Neville had not thought of it in those terms, but the logic was sound. He nodded. "Keep tracking," Hermione said, "and let me know if you need help cross-referencing with prefect incident reports. I have access to those." She returned to the table where Harry and Ron were working on astronomy charts. Neville folded the parchment sheets and returned them to his bag. The next morning, Gryffindor lost 28 points before lunch. Neville recorded each deduction with the same methodical attention he had maintained for 3 weeks. The system was broken, but documentation continued. Someone would eventually need this data, and when they did, it would be available. The detention scheduling system operated through a 3-tier administrative process. Minor infractions, tardiness, incomplete assignments, minor disruptions were handled at the department level. Individual professors assigned detention periods, typically 1 to 2 hours of supervised work in their classrooms or offices. These assignments were logged in departmental records, but did not require approval from heads of house or senior staff. Moderate infractions, repeated minor violations, cheating, unauthorized hexing, required head of house notification. The supervising professor submitted a written report, and the head of house determined appropriate consequences, which could include extended detention periods, point deductions, or restrictions on privileges such as Hogsmeade visits. Severe infractions, physical altercations, dangerous magical experimentation, violations of educational decrees that remained in effect, were escalated to the headmaster's office. These cases involved formal hearings and could result in suspension or expulsion. Most detentions fell into the first category. Students served an hour or two of evening work, completed their assigned tasks, and returned to normal schedules. The system processed dozens of these assignments weekly across all houses and year levels. Neville had served 4 detentions during his Hogwarts career, 2 in 3rd year for cauldron-related accidents in potions, 1 in 4th year for violating curfew during the Triwizard tournament complications, and 1 in 5th year under Umbridge's administration, though that detention had been interrupted by the Department of Mysteries incident and was never formally completed. He understood the basic mechanics of detention assignment, but had never examined the administrative details beyond his own direct experiences. This changed in the first week of November. On Tuesday morning, during the 15-minute interval between breakfast and first lessons, Neville observed a confrontation near the entrance hall. A second-year Gryffindor named Natalie MacDonald was being addressed by Mr. Filch, the caretaker. Filch held a clipboard and was reading from a handwritten list. Detention Thursday, 1900 hours. Trophy room polishing, Filch said. That's your 3rd this month. You'll be there until the work is finished, however long that takes. Natalie's expression showed confusion rather than defiance. But I didn't do anything wrong. Don't argue with the paperwork, Filch said. It's all here in writing. Professor Snape, October 28th. Disruption during potions class. Professor Flitwick, November 1st. Unsatisfactory homework. And yesterday, loitering in a restricted corridor during lesson time. I wasn't loitering, Natalie said. I had a free period, and Professor Flitwick gave me an acceptable on that homework, not a detention. Filch squinted at his clipboard. Says here, detention assigned. If there's an error, take it up with your professors. Meanwhile, you're expected Thursday at 1900. Don't be late. He walked away before Natalie could respond further. She stood near the staircase for several seconds, visibly uncertain, then proceeded toward the Transfiguration corridor for morning classes. Neville had been standing near the house point hourglasses, ostensibly checking the current standings, but actually waiting to record morning point changes. He had heard the entire exchange. 3 detentions in 1 month for a second-year student was unusual, unless the student had established a pattern of serious misbehavior. From what Neville had observed, Natalie MacDonald was a quiet student who kept regular hours and did not feature in corridor incidents or prefect reports. During lunch, Neville saw Natalie sitting with other second-year Gryffindors. She appeared to be explaining something to them, gesturing toward the head table where the professors sat. Her housemates responded with expressions of sympathy, but no apparent solutions. Neville finished his meal and proceeded to the library. He had no specific research objective, but wanted access to quiet space for consideration. The problem, as presented, contains several irregularities. First, detention assignments for incomplete or unsatisfactory homework were uncommon. Most professors used grade penalties or mandatory revision requirements rather than detention for academic underperformance, unless the student had failed to submit work multiple times without justification. Second, loitering in a restricted corridor required definition. If Natalie had been in an actually restricted area, the third-floor corridor, certain dungeons, or faculty-only sections, that would constitute a legitimate violation. However, her claim of having a free period suggested she had been in a general access area during authorized free time. Third, the accumulation of 3 detentions in rapid succession, all recorded by different professors, suggested either a sudden behavioral collapse or an administrative error affecting detention record keeping. Neville considered the possibility that this related to the house point deduction pattern he had been documenting. If unauthorized individuals retained access to administrative systems from the previous year's inquisitorial squad operations, they might have access not only to point deduction mechanisms, but also to detention assignment processes. He needed to verify whether Natalie's case was an isolated incident or part of a broader pattern. The Gryffindor Common Room maintained an informal communication network. Students discussed detention assignments openly, particularly when they felt the consequences were unjust. Neville spent Wednesday evening in the common room, positioning himself near the fireplace where younger students typically gathered for study groups. Over the course of 2 hours, he overheard references to detention assignments affecting at least 4 other Gryffindor students in years 2 through 4. None of these students had been involved in visible incidents during the past month. 2 were Muggle-born. On Thursday morning, Neville went to Professor McGonagall's office during her posted consultation hours. He waited outside for 12 minutes while she finished a meeting with a 7th-year student regarding NEWT examination accommodations. When the student departed, McGonagall opened the door and gestured for Neville to enter. "Mr. Longbottom," she said, "what can I assist you with?" "I wanted to inquire about detention assignment procedures," Neville said, "specifically how professors submit detention records and whether students can request review of assignments they believe are in error." McGonagall's expression shifted to something approaching concern. "Has someone assigned you a detention you feel is unwarranted?" "No, Professor, but I have observed other students receiving what appear to be questionable assignments. 2nd-year student Natalie MacDonald, for example. 3 detentions in 1 month for infractions that don't seem to match her normal behavior." McGonagall moved to her desk and retrieved a leather-bound ledger from the top drawer. She opened it to a marked page and scanned the entries. "Miss MacDonald, yes, I see 3 detention entries here." She read silently for a moment. These were submitted through proper channels, written reports from Professors Snape and Flitwick, and a corridor violation logged by Mr. Filch. "May I ask what the specific infractions were?" McGonagall hesitated. Student disciplinary records were confidential, but Neville's inquiry appeared to be motivated by legitimate concern rather than gossip. Professor Snape cited disruption during a practical exercise, talking during instruction. Professor Flitwick noted failure to complete revision work to acceptable standards. Mr. Filch recorded unauthorized presence in the fourth floor restricted section during lesson time. The fourth floor restricted section, Neville repeated. Which specific area? The corridor adjacent to the library. That corridor isn't restricted, Professor. It's a standard access route between the library and the main staircases. McGonagall closed the ledger. Mr. Longbottom, are you suggesting these detention assignments are fraudulent? I'm suggesting they may contain errors. If Miss MacDonald had a free period, she had authorization to be in that corridor. And if the other infractions are similarly questionable, she may be serving detentions for violations she didn't actually commit. That would require intentional misrepresentation by multiple staff members, McGonagall said. Her tone remained neutral, but her posture had become more rigid. Or administrative errors in how reports are filed, Neville said. If someone is submitting reports using professor names without proper authorization, the same way unsigned house point deductions have been appearing. McGonagall studied him for several seconds. You're aware of the house point discrepancies? Yes, Professor. I've been documenting them. I see. She returned the ledger to her drawer. I will review Miss MacDonald's detention assignments and verify their legitimacy. If errors are discovered, they will be corrected. However, I must ask that you not discuss this matter with other students. Speculation about administrative fraud creates unnecessary alarm. Yes, Professor. Is there anything else? No, Professor. Thank you. Neville left the office and returned to the common room. He had accomplished what he intended, bringing the detention issue to McGonagall's attention through formal channels. Whether she would investigate comprehensively or simply correct Natalie's specific case remained uncertain. Thursday evening, Natalie MacDonald appeared in the trophy room at 1900 as instructed. Filch assigned her 3 hours of polishing work on the Quidditch trophy cabinet. She completed the task at 21:45 and returned to Gryffindor Tower 15 minutes before curfew. On Friday morning, Professor McGonagall made an announcement during breakfast. She stood at the head table and raised her voice to carry across the Great Hall. Students should be aware that all detention assignments must now be submitted through written reports delivered directly to heads of house. Verbal notifications or indirect reporting through caretaker staff will not be accepted. Any student who receives a detention assignment without prior notification from their head of house should report this immediately to my office or the office of their respective head of house. She sat down without elaborating. The hall filled with murmured conversation as students processed the procedural change. At the Gryffindor table, Hermione leaned toward Neville. That's because of your conversation with her yesterday, isn't it? Possibly, Neville said. You reported administrative fraud. I reported detention assignments that appeared to contain errors. Hermione considered this. That's technically accurate, but strategically indirect. It achieved the necessary outcome, Neville said. Ron, sitting across from them, looked confused. What outcome? What are you two talking about? New detention procedures, Hermione said. They're closing a security gap in the administrative system. Right, Ron said, clearly still confused. He returned his attention to his breakfast. On Saturday, Neville encountered Natalie MacDonald in the entrance hall. She was checking the house point hourglasses her expression cautiously optimistic. Gryffindor had gained 15 points overnight, an unusual occurrence for weekend hours when classes were not in session. "Mr. Longbottom," she said when she noticed him. Professor McGonagall cancelled 2 of my detentions. She said there were administrative errors in the reports." "That's good," Neville said. "Was it because you talked to her?" Neville had not expected this question. Natalie was a second year. He had not informed her of his conversation with McGonagall, and student disciplinary discussions were supposedly confidential. However, information circulated through house networks despite administrative privacy protocols. "I mentioned concerns about detention procedures," Neville said. "Professor McGonagall investigated. If she found errors affecting your case, that's her decision to correct them." "Thank you," Natalie said. She appeared uncertain whether additional response was appropriate, then nodded and walked toward the great hall for breakfast. Neville remained near the hourglasses. The procedural change McGonagall had announced would prevent future fraudulent detention assignments, provided the new requirement was enforced consistently across all staff members. However, it did not address the underlying security issue: unauthorized access to administrative systems by individuals who should no longer have such access. That problem remained unresolved. Documentation would continue to be necessary. He proceeded to the library to continue his Saturday study routine. The morning remained routine, and systems operated as they were designed to operate, marginally improved by one procedural adjustment. The Gryffindor common room operated under a portrait-based security system. Access required providing the correct password to the fat lady who guarded the entrance on the 7th floor. The password changed at irregular intervals, typically every 2 to 3 weeks, though more frequent changes occurred during periods of heightened security concern or after suspected breaches. Password distribution followed an informal cascade system. The head boy and head girl received new passwords directly from the headmaster's office. They informed house prefects, who were responsible for announcing changes to their respective common rooms. Prefects typically made announcements during evening hours when most house members were present, posting the new password on notice boards and verbally confirming it with students who might have missed the initial communication. The system functioned adequately under normal circumstances. Students who missed announcements could ask prefects, housemates, or the fat lady herself, who maintained some discretion in assisting students she recognized as legitimate Gryffindor members. However, the system contained vulnerabilities related to social dynamics rather than security architecture. Neville first observed the problem during the second week of December. On Tuesday evening, he was returning from the library at approximately 20:15 hours, well before curfew, but late enough that most students had already completed dinner and evening activities. As he approached the fat lady's portrait, he noticed a first-year student standing several meters away from the entrance. The student, a boy Neville recognized but could not name, was not attempting to enter. He stood with his back against the corridor wall, holding a Transfiguration textbook against his chest. Neville slowed his approach. The first year glanced at him, then quickly looked away. "Do you need the password?" Neville asked. The boy hesitated. "No, I'm waiting for someone." "The password changed yesterday," Neville said. "If you missed the announcement, It's Fortis Fortuna. I know, the boy said quickly. I'm waiting for my friend. We're studying together. This explanation was plausible, but inconsistent with the boy's body language. He was not positioned as someone casually waiting for a companion. He stood pressed against the wall, textbook held defensively, avoiding eye contact. Neville provided the password to the fat lady and entered the common room. The space held approximately 30 students, normal population for a Tuesday evening. Several study groups occupied tables near the fireplace. Older students worked on individual assignments in quieter corners. No obvious tensions or conflicts were visible. He proceeded to the 6th-year dormitory and stored his library materials, then returned to the common room. Through one of the windows overlooking the corridor approach, he could see the first year still standing in the same position. 15 minutes had passed since Neville's entry. Neville left the common room and returned to the corridor. "Your friend hasn't arrived yet," he observed. The boy's face flushed. He might be delayed. "What's your name?" Jeffrey Hooper." "You're a first year?" "Yes." Neville waited. Jeffrey continued to avoid direct eye contact, focusing on the stone floor near Neville's feet. "Did someone tell you not to enter?" Neville asked. Jeffrey's expression confirmed this before he spoke. Some of the older students said, "They said first years need to wait until after 2100 if they left during study hours. That it's house tradition. You're not supposed to interrupt prefects when they're working." This was not house tradition. It was fabricated restriction designed to exclude younger students from common room access during peak evening hours. Neville recognized the pattern immediately. Social enforcement of artificial hierarchy, using fictional rules to establish dominance without formal authority. "That's not a real rule," Neville said. "You can enter the common room whenever you want, as long as you have the password and it's before curfew." "Who told you about this? Tradition." "Some third years. And a 5th-year prefect confirmed it." "Which prefect?" Jeffrey shifted his weight, but did not answer. Identifying the prefect would create direct confrontation, and first years had limited capacity to challenge older students without suffering social consequences. "Come with me," Neville said. He walked to the fat lady's portrait and provided the password. Jeffrey followed hesitantly. They entered the common room together. Inside, Neville scanned the space for 5th-year prefects. Cormac McLagan sat near the fireplace, reviewing what appeared to be Quidditch strategy diagrams. Neville approached him. "McLagan," Neville said, "did you tell first years they can't enter the common room before 2100 during study hours?" McLagan looked up from his diagrams. His expression showed mild annoyance at the interruption. "I told them to be respectful of older students' study time. If they're going to come in chattering and disrupting everyone, they should wait until later. That's not the same as prohibiting entry." "It's common sense," McLagan said. "First years allowed. They don't understand library rules yet. Keeping them out until after evening study sessions helps maintain focus for those of us with actual examinations to prepare for." "NEWTS are 2 years away for you," Neville said. "And first years have homework assignments too. They need access to common room study areas." McLagan set down his diagrams. "Longbottom, I don't know why you've decided to involve, but prefects handle these issues. If you have concerns, take them to Hermione or Ron." "I will," Neville said. He gestured for Geoffrey to follow him to a study table near the windows, far from McLagan's position but well within the common room proper. You can work here, he told Geoffrey. If anyone tells you to leave, they're inventing rules. Actual house rules come from prefects and McGonagall, and they're posted on the notice board. Geoffrey sat down carefully, opening his Transfiguration textbook as though expecting someone to challenge his presence. No one did. The common room continued its normal evening rhythm. Neville proceeded to the 6th year dormitory. He had identified a problem, but addressing it required understanding its scope. Over the next 3 days, Neville modified his schedule to observe common room entry patterns during evening hours. He positioned himself near windows overlooking the corridor approach, or found reasons to enter and exit the common room multiple times between 1900 and 2100. The pattern emerged clearly. First years and some second years were being told they could not enter during study hours, a fiction presented as established tradition. The restriction was not being enforced by prefects directly. Instead, older students, primarily 3rd through 5th years, were communicating the false rule through peer networks. Some of these students stood near the portrait entrance, creating an informal barrier through physical presence rather than explicit prohibition. Younger students who challenged the restriction were subjected to social consequences, mockery in corridors, exclusion from study groups, deliberate disruption of their belongings in dormitories. These consequences were subtle enough to avoid prefect attention, but sufficient to discourage resistance. The result was that approximately 12 to 15 first and second year students were avoiding the common room during prime study hours, the exact period when they most needed access to shared resources. Older students who could answer questions and supervised study environments. Neville documented the pattern with the same methodical attention he had applied to house point discrepancies and detention irregularities. He recorded dates, times, and names of students he observed waiting outside when they should have had unrestricted access. On Friday evening, he approached Hermione in the common room. Ron was present as well, working on a star chart for astronomy. Harry sat nearby, reading what appeared to be a potions textbook with considerable frustration evident in his posture. I need to discuss a common room access issue, Neville said. Hermione looked up from her arithmancy calculations. What kind of issue? Younger students are being told they can't enter during study hours. It's being presented as house tradition, but it's not real. They're being excluded through social enforcement. Ron frowned. Who's telling them that? Multiple students. McLagan confirmed it when I asked him directly. He claims it's about maintaining quiet study conditions, but the actual effect is excluding first and second years from accessing the common room during evening hours. Hermione set down her quill. That's completely inappropriate. Common room access is guaranteed for all house members regardless of year level. There are no restrictions on entry except for curfew and security, emergencies. I know, Neville said, but the students being affected don't know that, or they're too intimidated to challenge it. How many students are we talking about? Ron asked. At least 12 that I've observed directly. Possibly more who are avoiding the issue by staying in dormitories or finding alternative study locations. Harry closed his potions textbook. This is exactly the kind of thing Umbridge's inquisitorial squad used to do. Enforce fake rules to control people. I thought we were done with that. The inquisitorial squad was officially dissolved, Hermione said, but the students who participated in it are still here. They learned that social enforcement works, and they're applying those techniques without formal authority. She stood and walked to the notice board near the portrait entrance. She removed several outdated notices, a Hogsmeade visit schedule from October, a Quidditch practice cancellation from November, and posted a new parchment in a prominent position. Common room access policy. All Gryffindor students have unrestricted access to the common room at any time between 600 and curfew, 2200 for years 1 to 4, 2300 for years 5 to 7. There are no study hour restrictions. There are no year-based entry limitations. There are no traditions prohibiting first or second year access during evening hours. Students experiencing access problems should report immediately to prefects. Hermione Granger, 6th year prefect. She returned to the study table. That should clarify the official policy, but posting a notice won't stop social enforcement. We'll need to monitor the corridor during peak hours and intervene directly if students are being prevented from entering. I can do that, Neville said. You're not a prefect, Ron pointed out. You don't have authority to enforce house policies. I don't need authority to stand near the portrait entrance and tell first years the rules, Neville said. If someone challenges me, I can refer them to the posted notice or to you. Hermione considered this. That could work, but it shouldn't be your sole responsibility. Ron and I will adjust our patrol schedules to include the portrait approach during evening hours. If we make prefect presence more visible, it should discourage exclusionary behavior. What about students who are already intimidated? Harry asked. They might not try to enter even if we're standing right there. We'll need to communicate directly with them, Hermione said. Identify which students have been affected and inform them personally that they have full access rights. Individual confirmation carries more weight than general announcements. Neville retrieved his documentation from his bag, the parchment sheet where he had recorded names and observation times. He handed it to Hermione. She scanned the list. This is thorough. You've been tracking this for several days. Yes. Why didn't you report it sooner? I wanted to verify it was a pattern rather than isolated incidents. And I needed to confirm it wasn't being caused by actual prefect policy that I was unaware of. Hermione nodded. That's reasonable methodology. Thank you for documenting this. It makes intervention much more straightforward. She copied the names onto a separate parchment and returned Neville's original notes. Ron and I will speak with these students tomorrow. We'll also address the issue at the next prefect meeting. Make sure all house prefects understand that any restrictions on common room access are violations of house policy. On Saturday, Neville observed Hermione and Ron speaking individually with students from the documented list. The conversations occurred throughout the day, brief exchanges during breakfast, between Hogsmeade departures, in corridors before dinner. Each conversation lasted 2 to 3 minutes. Students' responses varied from relief to residual skepticism, but the information was being distributed. That evening, Neville positioned himself near the portrait entrance at 19:30. He brought a herbology reference to justify his presence, but did not open it. Instead, he maintained a visible position where approaching students could see him before reaching the fat lady. At 1945, Geoffrey Hooper approached with 2 other first years. All 3 hesitated when they saw Neville. "Password changed this morning," Neville said. "It's Draconis Dormion. You can enter whenever you want." The 3 students exchanged glances, then approached the portrait. Geoffrey provided the password, and all 3 entered. No one challenged them. At 2015, a second-year girl Neville recognized from herbology class arrived. She stopped several meters away, clearly preparing to wait. "Common room's open," Neville said. "New password is Draconis Dormion." "I know," the girl said quietly, "but I don't want to disturb the older students." "You're not disturbing anyone. It's a shared space. Go ahead." She approached slowly, provided the password, and entered. Through the portrait hole, Neville could hear the normal sounds of evening activity: conversation, chair movement, the rustle of parchment. No disruption occurred due to her entry. At 20:40, Cormac McLagan emerged from the common room. He noticed Neville and stopped. "You're standing guard now?" McLagan asked. "I'm providing password assistance," Neville said. "We don't need password assistance. Students know how to access their own common room." Some students were under the impression they shouldn't access it during certain hours. "I'm correcting that misunderstanding." McLagan's expression hardened. "You're undermining house cohesion. Older students have legitimate needs for quiet study environments. If first years can't respect that, there need to be consequences." "Consequences for what?" Neville asked. "Using a common room, they have equal rights to access." "Consequences for disrupting other students' education?" "Then address actual disruptions through actual prefect procedures," Neville said. "Don't prevent access based on hypothetical noise concerns." McLagan stepped closer, reducing the distance between them to less than a meter. He was taller than Neville and used this physical advantage to create implicit intimidation. "You need to stop inserting yourself into house management issues. You're not a prefect. You don't have responsibility for these decisions." "I'm not making decisions," Neville said. "I'm standing in a corridor during hours when I'm allowed to be here. If that makes younger students feel more comfortable entering their own common room, that's not a management issue. You're actively undermining established social structures." "There's no established structure being undermined." Hermione's voice came from behind McLagan. She had emerged from the portrait hole during the exchange. "There's a fabricated restriction being corrected. If you have concerns about noise or disruption, submit them through proper channels. Don't create unauthorized barriers to common room access." McLagan turned to face her. "You're supporting this?" "I posted the official policy on the notice board yesterday," Hermione said. "All students have unrestricted access during appropriate hours. That's not negotiable." "Fine," McLagan said. He walked past both of them toward the main staircase, his posture rigid with barely contained frustration. Hermione waited until he had descended out of sight, then turned to Neville. "How long were you planning to maintain this position?" "Until 2200, Neville said. "First years have curfew then, so there's no point continuing after that." "You don't need to do this alone. Ron and I will coordinate with the other prefects to ensure there's regular presence near the entrance during evening hours. Visible prefect monitoring should prevent future exclusionary behavior. "All right," Neville said. "But thank you," Hermione added, "for documenting the problem and bringing it to our attention, and for taking action before the situation became more entrenched." She returned to the common room. Neville remained near the portrait entrance until 2200, providing passwords to 3 more students who arrived during the final hour. All 3 entered without hesitation, once they understood access was not restricted. At 2205, Neville returned to the common room himself. The space had begun its evening transition toward curfew routines. Students gathering belongings, completing final assignments, preparing to return to dormitories. First and second years were present in normal proportions, integrated into study tables and conversation groups without apparent tension. The system had adjusted. A gap in access had been identified and closed. Common room usage patterns would normalize as students recognized that artificial restrictions had been removed. Neville proceeded to the 6th-year dormitory. Tomorrow, he would resume normal schedules. The monitoring that had been necessary during the correction period would no longer be required. Other systems and other gaps would need attention, but this particular issue had been addressed through the appropriate combination of documentation, formal reporting, and consistent presence. Hogwarts continued functioning because its systems could be corrected when problems were identified clearly and addressed methodically. The herbology greenhouses operated under a structured maintenance and supply system managed by Professor Sprout and her 2 teaching assistants, 7th-year students who received academic credit for administrative work. Equipment inventory included standard tools, dragon hide gloves, pruning shears, protective goggles, watering cans, repotting implements, and specialized instruments for handling dangerous specimens such as venomous tentacula and snargaluff pods. Each greenhouse maintained its own supply cupboard. Students collected necessary equipment at the beginning of practical lessons and returned items to designated storage locations at the end of each session. Professor Sprout conducted weekly inventory checks to identify damaged or missing items. Replacement requests were submitted to the school's central supply coordinator, who processed orders through approved vendors in Diagon Alley. The system functioned with minimal disruption under normal circumstances. Equipment damage occurred occasionally. Torn gloves from thorns, bent pruning shears from improper handling. But these incidents were classified as routine wear and addressed through standard replacement procedures. Neville spent more time in the greenhouses than most students. Herbology was his strongest subject, and Professor Sprout had granted him unsupervised access to Greenhouse 3 during free periods for independent study of advanced specimens. He maintained his own set of personal equipment, higher quality gloves, precision pruning tools, a magnifying lens for examining root structures, stored in a locked cabinet that Professor Sprout had allocated for his use. His familiarity with greenhouse operations and equipment standards allowed him to recognize irregularities that other students might not notice. On the second Monday of January, Neville arrived at Greenhouse 3 15 minutes before the scheduled 6th-year practical examination. The assessment would test students' ability to safely harvest bouncing bulb roots, a NEWT-level task requiring precise timing, proper restraint techniques, and appropriate protective equipment. Professor Sprout had emphasized during the previous week's lecture that torn gloves or faulty goggles would result in automatic failure, as safety violations could not be overlooked regardless of technical skill. Neville entered the greenhouse and proceeded to his personal equipment cabinet to retrieve his tools. As he passed the general supply cupboard, he noticed the door was slightly ajar. Unusual, as Professor Sprout maintained strict protocols about securing equipment storage between lessons. He opened the cupboard fully to investigate. The interior showed signs of disturbance. Dragonhide gloves had been removed from their organized shelves and restacked haphazardly. Several pairs lay on the floor. Pruning shears were scattered across the tool rack rather than hung in their designated positions. The protective goggle bin had been overturned, with goggles spilling onto the lower storage shelf. This level of disorganization did not occur through normal use. Students might occasionally misplace individual items, but wholesale disruption of storage systems indicated deliberate interference. Neville began examining equipment systematically. He picked up the first pair of dragon hide gloves from the floor and checked for damage. The left glove had a clean cut across 3 fingers. Not a tear from thorns or wear, but a deliberate slice made with a sharp instrument. He set these aside and checked the next pair. Similar damage, cuts along the palm section that would expose skin to dangerous plant materials. He continued through the entire glove inventory. 12 pairs showed deliberate damage. 8 pairs remained intact. The pruning shears presented different problems. Several pairs had been bent slightly at the hinge point, creating misalignment that would make precise cuts impossible. Others had dulled blades, not from use, but from grinding against stone or metal to remove the sharp edge artificially. The protective goggles were the most concerning. 6 pairs had cracked lenses, hairline fractures that might not be immediately visible, but would compromise protection during practical work. These cracks appeared to have been created through controlled pressure rather than accidental dropping. Neville checked the time, 0840. The practical examination began at 0900. 20 minutes remained before students arrived. He had several options. First, he could report the sabotage to Professor Sprout immediately. This would delay the examination while she investigated, verified the damage, and arranged replacement equipment. The delay would affect the entire day's lesson schedule and potentially require rescheduling the examination, which would create administrative complications for NEWT assessment timelines. Second, he could document the damage and report it after the examination concluded. This would allow the assessment to proceed on schedule, but would leave students using potentially compromised equipment, creating safety risks. Third, he could attempt to address the problem using available resources before the examination began. Neville chose the third option. The greenhouse system maintained reserve equipment supplies in the main storage facility adjacent to Greenhouse 1. These reserves existed primarily for replacing worn or damaged items between ordering cycles, ensuring that temporary equipment failures did not disrupt lesson schedules. Access to reserve supplies required Professor Sprout's authorization under normal circumstances, but Neville held a general access key that she had provided for his independent study work. He left Greenhouse 3 and walked quickly to the main storage facility. the door unlocked with his key. Inside, he located the equipment reserves: 36 pairs of dragonhide gloves in various sizes, 24 pruning shears, 15 sets of protective goggles, and various other implements. He selected 8 pairs of gloves in the sizes most commonly used by 6th-year students, 8 pruning shears, and 6 sets of goggles. These items went into a canvas equipment bag. He relocked the storage facility and returned to Greenhouse 3. Time remaining, 12 minutes. He removed the damaged equipment from the general supply cupboard and stored it temporarily in his personal cabinet, where it would not be accessed by students. He replaced these items with the reserve equipment, organizing everything according to Professor Sprout's standard storage protocol. Gloves arranged by size on upper shelves, pruning shears hung on the tool rack in ascending size order, goggles stacked in their designated bin. The cupboard now appeared properly organized and fully stocked. The sabotaged equipment was isolated where it could not cause harm. Neville returned his equipment bag to the storage facility. Time remaining, 4 minutes. At 08:55, students began arriving for the examination. Neville positioned himself near the specimen tables, ostensibly reviewing the bouncing bulb root structures, but actually monitoring equipment distribution. Professor Sprout arrived at 08:58, carrying her assessment clipboard and a specimen container for collecting harvested roots. "Good morning, everyone," she said. "This examination will proceed as outlined in last week's briefing. Collect your equipment from the supply cupboard: gloves, goggles, and pruning shears. Each of you will work with a designated bouncing bulb. You have 30 minutes to complete a successful harvest. Remember, safety first. Any unsafe practice results in automatic failure, regardless of whether you successfully extract the root." Students moved to the supply cupboard in small groups, retrieving equipment. Neville watched carefully. No one reported problems with gloves, goggles, or tools. The equipment functioned as it should. The examination proceeded without incident. 17 students completed successful harvests. 3 students failed, 2 due to improper restraint techniques that allowed the bouncing bulb to escape containment, 1 due to rushing the extraction process and damaging the root structure beyond usability. None failed due to equipment malfunction. Professor Sprout dismissed the class at 09:45. Students returned their equipment to the supply cupboard and departed for their next lessons. Neville remained in the greenhouse, ostensibly reviewing his personal notes on root harvesting techniques. When all students had left, Professor Sprout approached him. "Mr. Longbottom, you arrived early this morning." "Yes, Professor. I wanted to review the bouncing bulb specimens before the examination." "And did you notice anything unusual about the equipment cupboard?" Neville hesitated. Professor Sprout's tone suggested she already knew something had occurred. Denying it would be dishonest. Explaining it required admitting he had accessed reserve supplies without prior permission. "The cupboard was disorganized when I arrived," he said. "I examined the equipment and found that several items had been damaged: gloves cut, pruning shears bent, goggles cracked. I replaced them with reserve supplies from the main storage facility." Professor Sprout's expression remained neutral. "You replaced them without informing me?" "Yes, Professor. There wasn't sufficient time to report the problem, arrange investigation, and still conduct the... I prioritized maintaining the assessment timeline and ensuring students had access to safe equipment." That was a significant decision to make independently, Professor Sprout said. You assumed responsibility for verifying that replacement equipment met safety standards, and you accessed controlled storage without authorization for this specific purpose. Yes, Professor. She walked to the supply cupboard and examined the equipment currently stored there. These items are from reserve stock, standard quality, properly sized, correctly organized. She turned back to Neville. And the damaged equipment. In my personal cabinet, I can retrieve it for your examination. Please do. Neville opened his cabinet and removed the canvas bag containing the sabotaged items. He laid them out on one of the work tables, 12 pairs of cut gloves, 7 damaged pruning shears, 6 cracked goggles. Professor Sprout examined each item methodically. Her expression grew increasingly serious as she assessed the extent and nature of the damage. This wasn't accidental wear, she said. This was deliberate sabotage designed to compromise student safety during a practical examination. Yes, Professor. Do you know who was responsible? No, Professor. The greenhouse was empty when I arrived. The cupboard door was ajar, but I saw no one in the vicinity. Professor Sprout gathered the damaged items and placed them back in the canvas bag. This will need to be reported to the headmaster. Sabotage of examination equipment constitutes a serious violation, potentially endangering students and undermining academic assessment integrity. Yes, Professor. You should have reported this immediately rather than taking independent action, she continued. However, your assessment of the situation was accurate, and your solution preserved both student safety and examination scheduling. I will note this in my report to the headmaster. She paused, studying him with an expression that combined concern and curiosity. Mr. Longbottom, this is the 3rd incident this year where you've identified and addressed administrative problems, house point discrepancies, detention assignment errors, and now equipment sabotage. Are you seeking these problems, or are they finding you? Neville considered the question. I'm observing normal operations and noticing when they don't function as they should. The problems exist regardless of whether I notice them. I just happen to be paying attention. That's a diplomatic answer, Professor Sprout said. But it doesn't fully address my question. Why are you paying such close attention to these systems? Because someone needs to, Neville said. And most people don't notice until problems affect them directly. By then, the damage is already done. Professor Sprout nodded slowly. That's a reasonable philosophy, but it places considerable responsibility on you. You're not a prefect or staff member. Taking on institutional oversight isn't your obligation. I'm not taking on oversight, Neville said. I'm just responding to what I observe. If I see something wrong and I can address it, I do. That's not oversight. That's just paying attention. Perhaps, Professor Sprout said, but paying attention at the level you've been demonstrating requires effort and carries risk. If the sabotage this morning had been discovered by someone else, they might have assumed you were responsible. After all, you have unsupervised access to this greenhouse and the storage facilities. Your presence could have been interpreted as evidence rather than coincidence. Neville had not considered this possibility. Should I have reported it despite the timing concerns? In retrospect, yes. However, your instinct to prioritize student safety was sound. In the future, if you encounter similar situations, please inform me or another staff member immediately, even if it creates scheduling complications. We can manage delays. We cannot manage preventable injuries that occur because someone attempted to address safety issues independently. Yes, Professor. Now, regarding the investigation, I will need to file a formal maintenance report documenting the damaged equipment. This report will include your statement about discovering the sabotage and the actions you took to address it. The headmaster will likely want to interview you as part of the investigation. Are you comfortable providing a detailed account? Yes, Professor. Good. You're dismissed. Thank you for preventing what could have been a dangerous situation. That afternoon, Neville was summoned to the headmaster's office during what should have been a free study period. He climbed the spiral staircase and knocked on the door at the appointed time. Professor Dumbledore's voice called for him to enter. The office was as Neville remembered from previous visits: circular room, portraits of former headmasters lining the walls, various silver instruments on the desk performing unknown functions. Fawkes the Phoenix sat on his perch near the window, regarding Neville with calm golden eyes. Professor Dumbledore sat behind his desk, reading what appeared to be Professor Sprout's formal report. He gestured to a chair opposite his position. Please sit, Mr. Longbottom. I understand you had an eventful morning. Neville sat. Yes, sir. Professor Sprout has provided a comprehensive account of the greenhouse incident. I would like to hear your version, if you don't mind. Please include any details you remember about the state of the equipment cupboard, the nature of the damage, and your reasoning for the actions you took. Neville recounted the morning's events with the same attention to detail he had maintained throughout documentation of previous incidents. Dumbledore listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a separate parchment. When Neville finished, Dumbledore set down his quill. You've developed quite a pattern of identifying institutional problems this year. House point discrepancies, detention procedures, common room access restrictions, and now equipment sabotage. Professor McGonagall has mentioned your involvement in several of these matters. Yes, sir. I'm curious about your motivation. These aren't issues that directly affect you. You're not receiving false detentions. You're not excluded from the common room, and you maintain personal equipment for herbology work. Yet you've invested considerable time and effort in addressing problems that primarily impact other students. They're problems that shouldn't exist, Neville said. The systems are designed to work properly. When they don't, it means something is broken. If I can identify what's broken and help fix it, that seems necessary. Necessary, Dumbledore repeated. An interesting word choice. Not helpful or appropriate, but necessary. You feel these interventions are required rather than optional. Neville considered this. Yes, sir. If I notice something wrong and don't address it, the problem continues. Other students suffer consequences they shouldn't face. Systems degrade further. Addressing problems when they're identified prevents escalation. That's a sound principle, Dumbledore said. However, it assumes you have accurate assessment capabilities and appropriate intervention authority. How do you determine whether your observations are correct and whether your actions are warranted? I document patterns before drawing conclusions, Neville said. I verify information through multiple sources when possible. I report through proper channels when those channels exist. I only take independent action when reporting would create worse outcomes than intervention. As you did this morning with the greenhouse equipment. Yes, sir. Dumbledore leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. The damaged equipment has been examined by Professor Sprout and myself. The sabotage was sophisticated, designed to appear as accelerated wear rather than deliberate tampering, which would have made it difficult to prove intentional interference. However, the consistency of damage patterns across multiple items confirms this was coordinated action, not coincidental equipment failure. Do you know who was responsible? Neville asked. We have suspicions but insufficient evidence for formal accusations. The greenhouse facilities are not monitored by portraits or enchantments that would record unauthorized entry. Without witnesses or physical evidence linking specific individuals to the sabotage, we cannot pursue disciplinary action. So they won't face consequences. Not formal consequences, Number. However, we are implementing enhanced security protocols for all greenhouse facilities, including scheduled inventory checks before each examination period and restricted access to equipment storage. These measures should prevent similar incidents in the future. Dumbledore paused, studying Neville with the penetrating gaze that suggested he was perceiving things beyond visible surface details. Mr. Longbottom, you've demonstrated considerable courage this year. Not the dramatic courage of confronting dark wizards, but the steady courage of maintaining attention to detail, addressing problems despite social pressure, and accepting responsibility for interventions that could have negative personal consequences. This type of courage is less celebrated, but no less valuable. Neville did not know how to respond to this. He remained silent. However, Dumbledore continued, I must also caution you. The problems you've been addressing, administrative sabotage, social enforcement of false rules, systematic harassment of vulnerable students, these all share a common origin. Former participants in Dolores Umbridge's inquisitorial squad have retained the habits and methodologies they learned during her tenure. They continue to exploit institutional systems for personal advantage or to target students they view as weak or undesirable. Yes, sir, I've noticed that pattern. These individuals will not appreciate your interference with their activities. Your interventions have been successful precisely because you've operated quietly, documenting problems and reporting through appropriate channels rather than confronting perpetrators directly. If you shift to direct confrontation, you will expose yourself to retaliation that could be difficult to prevent or address through institutional mechanisms. I understand, sir. Do you? Dumbledore asked gently. I suspect you understand intellectually, but perhaps not fully emotionally. You are developing a reputation as someone who notices problems and takes action. That reputation will eventually reach the attention of those you've been quietly thwarting. When it does, they may respond with escalation designed to discourage your continued attention. Should I stop? Neville asked. That's not what I'm suggesting, Dumbledore said. I'm suggesting you remain aware of risks and continue to prioritize reporting through proper channels over independent action. The courage you've demonstrated is admirable, but it must be tempered with caution. The school benefits from students who pay attention to institutional functions, but I would prefer those students remain safe while doing so. Yes, sir. You're dismissed, Mr. Longbottom. Thank you for your cooperation with this investigation and for your continued attention to matters that improve the daily functioning of Hogwarts." Neville stood and left the office. As he descended the spiral staircase, he reflected on Dumbledore's warning. Direct confrontation was not his intention. He had no desire for conflict with former Inquisitorial Squad members or anyone else. He simply wanted systems to function as designed. But systems did not correct themselves. Someone had to notice problems and take action to address them. That responsibility was not officially his, but it was necessary nonetheless. The fourth-floor corridor between the library and the main staircase measured approximately 40 meters in length. It connected high-traffic areas and remained busy during most daylight hours, with reduced activity during evening study periods and minimal traffic after 2100. The corridor contained no classrooms, which meant it served purely as transitional space rather than destination location. Portraits lined both walls, former headmasters and notable Hogwarts figures who observed corridor activity and occasionally reported unusual incidents to staff. However, portrait monitoring was inconsistent. Some portraits slept during daylight hours. Others engaged in conversations with neighboring frames rather than observing student movements. The coverage was present, but not comprehensive. Prefect patrols included this corridor in their standard routes, but timing was predictable. Tuesday and Thursday patrols passed through at approximately 20:15 and 21:15. Other days showed different patterns based on the rotating schedule. Students who wished to conduct activities without immediate staff or prefect attention could identify gaps in monitoring through observation of these patterns. Neville had noticed such gaps during his common room access monitoring in December. He had not documented them systematically because they did not directly relate to the exclusion problem he was addressing. However, the knowledge remained available for reference if circumstances required it. On the second Thursday of February, circumstances required it. Neville was returning from the library at 19:45, earlier than his usual evening departure, but necessary because he had agreed to help a third-year Gryffindor with herbology homework at 2000. He carried 3 reference books and a sheaf of parchment notes on shrivel fig cultivation practices. As he entered the fourth-floor corridor from the library end, he heard voices ahead. Not the casual conversation of students moving between locations, but sharper exchanges suggesting confrontation. He slowed his approach. Approximately halfway down the corridor, near the portrait of Damara Dodderidge, 5 students were positioned in a cluster. 3 older students, 2 Slytherin 6th years, and 1 7th-year Neville, recognized as a former Inquisitorial Squad member named Montague, were blocking the path of 2 younger students. The younger students were pressed against the wall, their positions defensive. Neville moved closer, maintaining his normal walking pace, but adjusting his trajectory to pass near the group. As the distance decreased, the conversation became audible. "Don't belong here," Montague was saying. "Your kind shouldn't be allowed to contaminate the castle with your presence." One of the younger students, a 4th-year girl Neville recognized from herbology classes, responded in a voice that trembled slightly but remained clear. "We have every right to be here. We're students, just like you." "You're not students," One of the sixth years said, "Your charity cases, Dumbledore's pet project. If the school had proper standards, you'd be cleaning floors instead of pretending to learn magic." The second younger student, a boy Neville did not recognize, attempted to move past the group. Montague shifted position to block him. "We're not finished talking to you." Neville reached the group and stopped. "The corridors for general transit. You need to clear the path." The three older students turned toward him. Montague's expression shifted from aggressive focus to dismissive irritation. "This doesn't concern you, Longbottom. Keep walking." "You're blocking corridor access," Neville said. "That's a violation of basic school movement regulations. Either continue your conversation somewhere else or allow these students to pass." "We're having a discussion," the second sixth year said, "about appropriate standards for student admission, educational policy, nothing that violates regulations." "Educational policy discussions don't require physical blocking of corridor space," Neville said. "Step aside." Montague moved toward Neville, closing the distance between them to less than half a meter. He was taller than Neville by several inches and used this physical advantage the same way McLaggen had during the common room incident, creating implicit threat through proximity and size differential. "You've been interfering with house business all year," Montague said quietly. "Reporting prefects, challenging detention assignments, making it difficult for people to maintain proper order. That needs to stop." "I'm not interfering with anything," Neville said. "I'm standing in a public corridor addressing a clear violation of school regulations. If you have a problem with that, report it through proper channels." "Proper channels," Montague repeated, his tone mocking. "You think proper channels matter? You think the staff cares about maintaining standards anymore? They let anyone into this school now. Mudbloods walking the same corridors as purebloods, pretending they're equals. Someone needs to remind them of their place." The term Montague used, mudbloods, was recognized across the wizarding community as deeply offensive, specifically targeting Muggle-born witches and wizards. Its use in Hogwarts was technically prohibited under general conduct codes, though enforcement was inconsistent and often depended on whether staff members witnessed the usage directly. Neville had heard the term before. It had been common during Umbridge's tenure, used casually by inquisitorial squad members when harassing students they deemed inferior. The fact that Montague was using it now in a semi-public corridor suggested either extreme confidence that no consequences would follow or deliberate provocation designed to elicit reaction that could be reported as student aggression. "That language violates student conduct codes," Neville said, keeping his voice level. "And your presence here is preventing these students from accessing authorized school areas. Move aside." "Make me," Montague said. This was direct challenge. Montague was creating a situation where Neville would need to either physically force passage, which would constitute assault and result in immediate disciplinary action, or withdraw and allow the harassment to continue. Neville considered his options. He could attempt to bypass the group and escort the younger students around them, but the corridor width and Montague's positioning made this physically difficult without contact. He could leave and report the incident to the nearest staff member, but that would require abandoning the younger students to continued harassment during his absence. He could maintain position and continue verbal challenge, hoping that extended confrontation would either convince the older students to withdraw or attract attention from portraits or passing staff. He chose the third option. "I'm not moving," Neville said, "and neither are you until you allow these students to pass or a staff member arrives to address this situation formally." "Then we'll be here a while," Montague said, "because no staff are scheduled in this corridor for another—" He checked an ornate pocket watch. 35 minutes. Plenty of time for our discussion to continue. Behind Montague, the two younger students remained pressed against the wall. The girl's expression showed fear now, not just defiance. The boy was looking toward the staircase end of the corridor, as though calculating whether he could run fast enough to escape if opportunity arose. Neville shifted his position slightly, moving to stand more directly between the older students and the younger ones. This created physical separation and made it impossible for Montague to maintain intimidating proximity to both groups simultaneously. "You're choosing to make this difficult," Montague said to Neville. "That's going to have consequences for you." "Probably," Neville agreed, "but it's going to have consequences for you as well. Because we're not in an empty corridor. We're surrounded by portraits, and at least 3 of them are currently observing this conversation. When a staff member eventually asks what happened here, there will be multiple witnesses who can provide detailed accounts." Montague glanced toward the nearest portraits. Damara Dodderidge was indeed watching their group with focused attention. 2 portraits further down the corridor, a former professor of astronomy and a medieval knight, had turned from their previous activities to observe the confrontation. "Portraits can be encouraged to misremember details," Montague said, "especially if students discuss things with them privately afterward." "Threats to witnesses," Neville said. "That's an additional violation. You're building quite a comprehensive disciplinary record for this incident." The 7th year's expression hardened. For several seconds, no one moved. The corridor remained frozen in confrontational standoff. Then footsteps echoed from the staircase end of the corridor. All 5 students turned toward the sound. Professor McGonagall was ascending the stairs, carrying a stack of examination parchments and moving at her characteristic brisk pace. Montague stepped back from Neville immediately. The 2 6-years shifted away from the younger students, creating a space that suggested casual conversation rather than intimidation. The physical arrangement transformed in less than 3 seconds, attempting to present innocuous appearance before the professor reached their position. McGonagall arrived at the group and stopped. Her sharp gaze swept across all 7 students, assessing the situation with the practiced efficiency of decades of corridor management. "Mr. Montague," she said, "Mr. Pusey, Mr. Warrington, what are you doing in this corridor at this hour?" "Discussing course schedules, Professor," Montague said smoothly. "We were helping these younger students understand NEEWT progression requirements." McGonagall's expression suggested she did not believe this explanation. "And Mr. Longbottom was participating in this academic discussion?" "Just happened to be passing through," Montague said. McGonagall turned to Neville. "Is that accurate, Mr. Longbottom?" Neville had several options for response. He could confirm Montague's fabricated explanation, allowing the incident to conclude without. He could provide a partial truth that acknowledged confrontation without detailing specific language or threats. he could report the situation fully and accurately, triggering formal investigation and disciplinary procedures. He chose the third option. "No, Professor," Neville said. "I observed Mr. Montague and his companions blocking corridor access for these two students. When I asked them to clear the path, Mr. Montague used prohibited language to describe Muggle-born students and made threats regarding consequences for my interference. The confrontation lasted approximately 5 minutes before your arrival. 3 portraits witnessed the entire incident." McGonagall's posture became noticeably more rigid. "Mr. Montague, is this accurate?" "Absolutely not," Montague said. "We were having a civil conversation. Longbottom misinterpreted." "I'm not asking for your interpretation," McGonagall interrupted. "I'm asking whether you used prohibited language regarding Muggle-born students." Montague hesitated. Denying it completely would contradict portrait testimony, which McGonagall could verify. Admitting it would confirm rule violation. He chose evasion. "I may have used unfortunate phrasing in the context of a theoretical discussion about admission standards." "Theoretical discussions do not require physically blocking younger students in corridors," McGonagall said. Her tone had shifted from inquiry to formal disciplinary mode. "All 5 of you, come with me. We will continue this conversation in my office where formal statements can be recorded." "Professor, I have Quidditch practice," Pusey began. "Which you will miss," McGonagall said. "Mr. Longbottom, you as well. I will need your written account of this incident." She turned to the 2 younger students, her expression softening slightly. "Your names, please." "Anna Winslow, Professor," the girl said. "4th year Hufflepuff." "Michael Cornfoot," the boy said. "4th year Ravenclaw." "You're both dismissed," McGonagall said. "However, I may need to interview you tomorrow regarding what occurred here. Please make yourselves available during my office hours." Both younger students nodded and left quickly, moving toward the staircase at a pace that suggested profound relief at being released from the situation. McGonagall gestured for the remaining students to precede her down the corridor. "Walk straight to my office. Do not speak to each other during transit." The group proceeded in silence. Montague's expression showed controlled anger. Pusey and Warrington appeared more uncertain, likely calculating potential consequences. Neville maintained neutral attention to their route, observing surroundings with the same methodical awareness he applied to all institutional navigation. McGonagall's office interview process lasted 2 hours. Each student was questioned separately, while others waited in the corridor outside. Neville was interviewed 4th, after Montague and the 2 6-years had provided their accounts. McGonagall sat behind her desk, a blank incident report form positioned before her alongside a self-inking quill. "Mr. Longbottom, please provide a complete and accurate account of what occurred in the 4th floor corridor this evening. Include specific language used, physical positioning of all individuals, and the sequence of events from your initial observation through my arrival." Neville recounted the incident with precision, positions of students, exact phrasing of Montague's statements, physical intimidation tactics, duration of confrontation, portrait witnesses present. McGonagall's quill recorded everything without her needing to touch it, translating his verbal account into written documentation. When he finished, McGonagall reviewed the parchment. "This contradicts Mr. Montague's statement significantly. He claims There was no harassment, no use of prohibited language, and no physical intimidation, merely a discussion that you misinterpreted due to personal bias. "I don't have personal bias regarding Mr. Montague," Neville said. "I have accurate observation of what occurred." "The portraits will confirm that," McGonagall said. "I will interview them after completing student statements. However, I want to ensure you understand the implications of filing this formal report. Mr. Montague is a 7th-year student with family connections and social influence. Accusing him of harassment and use of prohibited language will result in formal disciplinary proceedings. He will likely retaliate through social channels or coordinate with other students to create difficulties for you. Are you prepared to accept those consequences?" "Yes, Professor." "Why?" McGonagall asked. "You could have walked past this incident. You could have reported it privately without making yourself a formal witness. Why did you choose direct confrontation and official statement?" "Because the younger students needed immediate intervention," Neville said. "And because reporting privately wouldn't have created the same level of accountability. Official statements require official response. Private reports can be dismissed or handled informally. I wanted to ensure this incident was documented properly." McGonagall studied him for several seconds. "You've changed considerably since your first year, Mr. Longbottom. The student who could barely speak in classes now files formal witness statements against 7th years without hesitation." "The systems needed someone to file statements," Neville said. "It happened to be me." "I suspect it's more than coincidence," McGonagall said. "But that's a philosophical discussion for another time. You're dismissed. Stay available for follow-up questions if the investigation requires additional information." Neville stood and left the office. Outside in the corridor, Montague stood with Pusey and Warrington, waiting to be dismissed. As Neville passed, Montague spoke quietly. "This isn't finished, Longbottom." Neville didn't respond. He continued walking toward Gryffindor Tower, maintaining steady pace, aware that consequences were now inevitable, but accepting them as necessary costs of formal accountability. The system required witnesses. He had served that function. Whatever followed would follow. The owlery operated on a self-service basis. Students brought their letters, selected available owls based on delivery distance requirements, and attached correspondence to the owl's leg using standard binding clips stored in wall-mounted containers near the entrance. The owls departed when ready, following internal navigation mechanisms that allowed them to locate recipients across Britain and continental Europe with reliable accuracy. Neville had used the owlery twice during his first year, once to write his grandmother about his broken wrist after a flying lesson accident, once to request permission for a Hogsmeade visit that she had denied. Since then, his correspondence with her had been minimal. Obligatory term start confirmations, holiday arrangements, responses to her inquiries about academic performance. She wrote to him more frequently than he wrote to her. Her letters arrived every 3 to 4 weeks, carried by the family owl, a grey screech owl named Artemis. The letters followed consistent formats: inquiries about grades, reminders about family reputation and expectations, occasional mentions of St. Mungo's, staff reports regarding his parents' conditions. The tone remained formal, focused on duty and standards rather than personal connection. Neville responded to these letters with equally formal confirmations. Yes, His grades were acceptable. Yes, he was maintaining appropriate conduct. Yes, he would visit during the designated holiday period. He did not write about house point discrepancies, detention procedures, greenhouse sabotage, or corridor confrontations. These matters fell outside the scope of acceptable topics for Longbottom family correspondence. However, during the first week of March, Neville began drafting letters he had no intention of sending. The first letter was composed on Tuesday evening after returning from dinner. He sat at his desk in the sixth-year dormitory, parchment positioned before him, quill held in his right hand with the careful grip Professor McGonagall had corrected during his third year. Dear Grandmother, I wanted to inform you of activities I have undertaken this term. In September, I began documenting house point deductions that appeared inconsistent with observable disciplinary incidents. This documentation revealed systematic administrative fraud, unauthorized individuals submitting false deductions to undermine Gryffindor's standing. Professor McGonagall has been addressing the issue, but correction processes remain incomplete. In November, I identified detention assignment irregularities affecting younger students. Investigation confirmed that former Inquisitorial Squad members retained access to administrative systems and were using them to target Muggle-born students with false disciplinary records. I reported this to Professor McGonagall, resulting in revised detention procedures that closed the security vulnerability. In December, I addressed social enforcement of fabricated common room access restrictions designed to exclude first and second-year students during evening study hours. Working with house prefects, we corrected the policy and established monitoring to prevent future exclusionary practices. In January, I discovered sabotaged equipment in the herbology greenhouses. Before a practical examination, I replaced damaged items with reserve supplies to maintain examination schedule and student safety. Professor Dumbledore confirmed this was deliberate sabotage, though insufficient evidence existed to identify responsible individuals. In February, I intervened in a corridor incident where seventh-year students were harassing Muggle-born fourth years using prohibited language and physical intimidation. I filed a formal witness statement. Disciplinary proceedings are ongoing. I am writing to inform you of these activities because they represent actions I believe were necessary and appropriate, though they deviate from your instructions to maintain low visibility and avoid drawing attention to the Longbottom name. I understand this may disappoint you. Neville. He read the letter twice, then folded it and placed it in his trunk beneath his spare robes. He did not address it. He did not take it to the owlery. The second letter was written on Friday, during a free period he had allocated for potions revision, but instead spent sitting near a window overlooking the lake. Dear Grandmother, you have often expressed concern about my performance at Hogwarts, my grades, my conduct, my ability to uphold family standards. I want you to know that I understand these concerns stem from your expectations regarding what a Longbottom should accomplish. However, I have realized that the actions I consider most important this year are not reflected in academic transcripts or house point totals. They are documented in administrative reports, staff incident files, and the experiences of students who are able to attend classes, access common rooms, and complete examinations without facing fraudulent disciplinary consequences or sabotaged equipment. I do not expect you to agree that these activities represent valuable contributions. I know your priorities emphasize traditional measures of success, grades, house championships, academic awards. But I have discovered that I am more effective at identifying institutional problems and addressing them methodically than I am at achieving academic distinction or social prominence. This letter is to inform you, though I will not send it, that I am satisfied with this role, even if it does not align with your vision for how I should represent the family name. Neville. This letter joined the first in his trunk. The third letter was written on Monday of the following week, after receiving notification that Montague had been suspended for 2 weeks and given formal warning regarding future conduct violations. Pusey and Warrington received 1-week detentions and point deductions, but no suspension. Dear Grandmother, disciplinary proceedings concluded today regarding the February corridor incident. The 7th-year student I filed a witness statement against has been suspended. This outcome confirms that formal reporting through proper channels can produce institutional response even when addressing harassment by students with social influence and family connections. I know you would likely counsel that I should have avoided involvement in this situation, that drawing official attention creates unnecessary risk and complications. However, avoiding involvement would have meant allowing the harassment to continue. I was not willing to accept that outcome. I am writing this letter because I want to articulate a principle I have developed this year. When systems fail to protect students who cannot protect themselves, someone must intervene. That intervention carries risks and consequences, but those costs are preferable to allowing systematic harm to continue unaddressed. I suspect you would not agree with this principle. I am not seeking your agreement. I am documenting it for my own clarity. Neville. He folded this letter more carefully than the previous 2, as though the precision of the fold could substitute for actual transmission. By mid-March, Neville had accumulated 7 letters in his trunk. None were addressed. None were sealed. None would be sent. The writing process served a different function than communication. It created structured space for articulating observations, principles, and decisions that had no other appropriate venue. He could not discuss these matters with his grandmother in person. Her responses would be predictable criticisms focused on family reputation and inappropriate risk-taking. He could not burden fellow students with extended explanations of his reasoning. He could write reports for staff when required, but those reports needed to maintain formal objectivity rather than personal reflection. The unsent letters provided a format for processing the gap between his grandmother's expectations and his actual priorities. On Thursday afternoon, during herbology practical work in Greenhouse 3, Professor Sprout approached Neville's workstation. He was propagating dittany cuttings, routine maintenance work that Professor Sprout had delegated to him for the past month. Mr. Longbottom, do you have a moment? Neville set down his pruning shears and turned toward her. Yes, Professor. I've been asked to revise the prefect patrol schedule for next term. The current rotation has several gaps, corridors with insufficient coverage, time periods where monitoring is too thin to address incidents effectively. I'm consulting with students who have demonstrated attention to institutional operations. Would you be willing to review the proposed schedule and identify potential vulnerabilities? This was not a request Neville had anticipated. I'm not a prefect, Professor. Wouldn't this be more appropriate for house prefect coordination? Prefects review schedules from their own operational perspective, Professor Sprout said. I'm asking you to review from a systems perspective, looking for gaps that could be exploited by students attempting to circumvent monitoring. Your documentation of various incidents this year suggests you understand how people identify and exploit administrative vulnerabilities. That insight would be valuable for schedule design. I can do that, Neville said. Thank you. I'll provide you with the draft schedule tomorrow. Take whatever time you need for analysis, then submit written recommendations through my office. She returned to supervising other students' propagation work. Neville resumed his Dittany cuttings, processing this new development. Professor Sprout was essentially requesting he apply observational methods he had been using reactively, documenting problems after they appeared, to proactive system design aimed at preventing problems before they occurred. This represented a different category of institutional involvement, not emergency intervention or formal reporting, but consultation regarding structural improvement. He completed the Dittany propagation work and cleaned his station according to standard protocols. As he left the greenhouse, he noticed the main supply cupboard, now secured with an enhanced locking charm that Professor Sprout had installed after the January sabotage incident. The system had adjusted. The vulnerability had been addressed. The greenhouse operated normally, marginally improved by one procedural modification. On Saturday morning, Neville sat in the library reviewing the prefect patrol schedule Professor Sprout had provided. The document spanned 4 parchment sheets, detailing corridor assignments, time blocks, and rotation patterns for all 4 houses across a 2-week cycle. He spent 3 hours analyzing the schedule, mapping coverage gaps against his observations from the previous 6 months. He identified 7 periods with insufficient monitoring in high-traffic corridors, 3 time blocks where prefect positioning allowed easy circumvention, and 2 rotation patterns that created predictable gaps students could exploit. His written recommendations filled 2 additional parchment sheets. He included specific suggestions for coverage adjustments, time block modifications, and rotation pattern changes that would eliminate identified vulnerabilities while maintaining manageable workload distribution for prefects. He delivered the analysis to Professor Sprout's office on Sunday afternoon. She reviewed his recommendations while he waited. "This is thorough," she said after several minutes. "You've identified gaps I hadn't considered, particularly the 3rd floor corridor issue near the trophy room. This rotation pattern creates a 15-minute window where that entire section goes unmonitored twice per week." "Yes, Professor. I observed that during the detention procedure investigation. It hasn't caused problems yet, but the vulnerability exists. I'll incorporate these recommendations into the final schedule," Professor Sprout said, "and I'll credit your contribution in the documentation submitted to the headmaster's office. You've provided a valuable service to the school's operational efficiency." "Thank you, Professor." He left her office and returned to Gryffindor Tower. As he climbed the stairs, he reflected on the trajectory of his activities this year. It had begun with simple observation, noticing that house points decreased without apparent cause, It had progressed through documentation, formal reporting, emergency intervention, and now consultation regarding preventive system design. None of these activities appeared in academic transcripts. None contributed to house point standings or Quidditch victories. None aligned with traditional markers of student success, but they represented contributions that maintained institutional function. Systems worked because people paid attention to how they worked and took action when they failed. That evening, Neville wrote an 8th letter. Dear Grandmother, this year I have learned that paying attention matters more than being impressive. The students whose equipment wasn't sabotaged, whose detention records weren't fraudulent, whose common room access wasn't restricted. They will never know that someone was documenting problems and reporting them through proper channels. That anonymity is appropriate. The goal was never recognition. I am writing to tell you this because I want to acknowledge that your expectations shaped me, even though my actions do not fulfill those expectations in ways you would prefer. You taught me that a Longbottom has obligations. I have accepted that principle. I have simply applied it to different obligations than you intended. I will not send this letter, but I needed to write it. Neville. He folded it with the same care he had applied to the previous 7 and placed it in his trunk. The letters accumulated. The systems adjusted. Hogwarts continued operating marginally, improved by incremental corrections, sustained by attention to detail rather than dramatic intervention. Spring term proceeded. Students attended classes. Prefects maintained patrols. Examinations approached. The school functioned because it was designed to function, and because when it failed, someone noticed and responded.